Alex, welcome. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to that one.
I am too. We're going to get to go deep on a lot of aspects of what I think is a very important topic of circadian biology and how we can optimize that. Before we jump into the sleep talk, though, I would love to hear, I have a note from your bio that you've lived in 5 countries over the last, I think, 15 years. And I would love to hear which ones and what led to all the moves.
Yes, of course, I'm happy to share that. So I'm originally from Bulgaria, a small Eastern European country, and because of different reasons, I didn't have the chance to leave my country to go anywhere until I was 20 years old, when I did the move to work and travel in Alaska, actually. So I traveled around 15,000 kilometers to work during the summer in a fish factory. So it was a grueling experience, but quite insightful in many ways for me in my personal development. After that, I decided to use my savings, what I managed to earn and save in my education. So I did a course in London. I spent some time there, but I also lived in Germany, did my exchange program in Berlin a few years later, and then I did my master's in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and a few years later I moved to Spain, where I'm currently based in Barcelona.
Quite the adventures. And those are some beautiful countries to live in. I have a friend who's actually working on a fishing boat in Alaska right now. So,
oh, really? Wow, that's very difficult.
Yeah. Well, you are deeply involved in the research and work around circadian biology. And I think believe it's called chronobiology, which is the science of understanding that. And I would love to go deep on this topic today. But to start off foundationally, can you just explain for us maybe some of the core aspects of circadian biology? And then from there, we'll talk about the different factors that are big needle movers within affecting circadian biology.
Of course, yes, I'll be happy to. So circadian biology or circadian rhythms is an internal mechanism that each one of us has, also animals, plants, and it impacts more or less every biological process we can think of, from mood, alertness, sleep, immune response, metabolism. Everything in our body is dictated by our internal body clock or circadian rhythms. So anything, what circadian biology does and chronobiology is the timing of doing different activities, whether this is any of those. We see it as a foundation in general health because it impacts everything that we can think of regarding the body.
And I've talked before about some of the factors that really come into play as big needle movers, and people are probably even tired of hearing me talk about light being such an important needle mover when it comes to this. And I talked extensively about morning sunlight, for instance. I've even done a whole podcast just about that, as well as like midday sun and the different way that different types of light impact our biology. And so I would say from my just personal experience, it seems like light, temperature, and food are all big impactors of circadian biology. So I'd love for you to explain maybe at a high level how those things impact circadian biology, and also if there are any other factors that I've missed.
Of course, yeah, I'll be happy to share that. So light is by far the most powerful signal for our brain and body to regulate the circadian rhythm. Morning light, of course, it is essential for resetting the biological rhythm, and the other is general light hygiene includes light during the day and light avoidance in the evening before going to bed. So we want to get as bright light as possible in the morning and during the day. Blue light, as we'll probably talk later during our conversation, what we do with AO, is by far the most powerful light to suppress melatonin, regulate the circadian rhythm. So that's why we talk a lot also about blue light in the evening to avoid that. So light is one, and it's the most, let's say, effective way to regulate and support our circadian rhythm. Second is exercise. So the time of day when we exercise can also shift the rhythm in one direction or the other. Food, as you said, especially breakfast and evening. So the type of food which is closer to sleep has a big impact on the circadian rhythm. And as you said, temperature. So cold showers, warm showers. So this is something that we can play with to kind of further support the circadian rhythm, but these are kind of the main factors that are influencing it.
And you said something important there. I think this is important to delve into, which is blue light and when it's important, because I think thanks to
Yes.
the biohacking movement, people are starting to understand we want to avoid that type of light at night. But I've seen almost like a widespread avoidance of blue light because of this. And I've seen people even wearing really heavy blue blockers during the day. And I think it's important to parse out blue light itself is not bad from my understanding. In fact, it's actually really important. And during the day, you want that bright light, you want blue spectrum of light. It's just the timing, right? So can you walk us through maybe in an optimal perspective, what light exposure at different times of day looks like?
Of course, yes, definitely. So blue light, especially blue turquoise light, which is the circadian type of light, typically between 450 and 500 nanometers, is the light that is most effective for supporting the circadian rhythm and suppressing it. So in the morning upon waking up, ideally we would want to go out and get sunlight. That's typically within the first 1 or 2 hours. During the day, if we can get light as well, it's good, but it's not going to have such a big impact as it is closer to basically in the morning or in the evening before going to bed, because outside of these hours, we get into the so-called circadian dead zone, meaning that if you're getting the light, it's not going to impact your circadian rhythm that much or almost none. So we want to get bright light, blue light in the morning upon waking up to reset the rhythm, wake up the body. So when we get that type of light, our body gets more alert, our brain gets more alert. A lot of processes happen in the body, including increase of metabolism, many other things. And obviously, as you've heard many times, avoiding blue light, in general, avoiding dimming the lights and avoiding bright light in the evening before going to bed is essential, because our eyes are much more susceptible to bright light in the evening than it is in the morning and during the day, when we want to get as much bright light as possible. So even with a little bit of light in the evening, we can actually kind of give this alerting effect to the brain and to keep us awake as well. So yeah, in general, a lot of bright light in the morning, and in the evening we want to dim the lights.
Yeah, and I think often it's the simplest things that get underestimated simply because they are so simple. But I always love to encourage this with people, because I've seen a huge difference in my sleep and my energy levels when I started making this a reliable habit. So my advice from a personal standpoint, with my own experience, is that I set sort of guidelines for myself where before I am on a screen in the morning, I make sure I go out in the sunlight. Even if it's a cloudy day, you're getting so much more light outside, not through a window, not through glasses or sunglasses, just outside. And so I try to also not drink coffee until about at least 90 minutes after I wake up. And I try to drink at least 32 ounces of water with minerals before I drink coffee. And just those little habits have made such a huge difference in my energy levels. And so I always encourage that. I'm like, this is free. We can all do this. It doesn't cost anything. Same thing with midday sunlight. To your point, that bright light is so important for letting the body know that it's daytime, that's the time when our hormones are supposed to respond to being awake and alert and during the day and moving. I think often the bright sunlight gets discounted because for a while we've had this fear of the sun, which though it's controversial, I definitely don't think that we need to be afraid of the sun. I know I feel drastically better when I get bright sunlight as well. It doesn't have to be for a long period of time, but we know that the sunlight, that bright midday light, stimulates our mitochondria to function more optimally. It can be really good for the thyroid. And then, like you said, that starts also, both of those exposures start our clock for sleep. And so getting good sleep actually, I think, starts when we wake up, not when we start our bedtime routine. And I think those little shifts can make a huge difference. And then to your point, avoiding those types of light so the body doesn't think it's afternoon when it's after sunset. Even I've talked about this before, but I have red light bulbs and lamps in my house. And after sunset, we turn off the big lights and we turn on the red lights, which are not like so dark we can't see, but they're red spectrums. There's not blue light. And that really, as a parent, tends to help calm everybody in the whole house, which is great for bedtime.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. Two things are very important when dimming the lights. One is avoiding blue light whenever possible, of course. And the other is dimming the lights to as little as possible. So keeping it to a level where it's obviously not dangerous for you to walk around. So there should be enough light, but at the same time, just keeping it low. So these two are essential. Obviously, there is the big topic, especially in children, about smartphones, electronic devices, TVs, etc. Basically, digital screens. And here it's not only about the light and the brightness, it's also about the fact that when you're in social media, when you're doing something that is actively stimulating, especially video games, for example, it has an alerting effect as well. So it keeps you awake. The light and the brightness of light, as well as what you're actually doing, can really have an impact. And there were some fabulous studies done, for example, on even using e-tablets for reading a book, even though it emits light compared to a book that you read on paper. There has not been a very big difference in the way, in how many minutes you need to fall asleep if you keep the light low. So it's not also that much about, having it an electronic device and emitting a little bit of light. It's also about what you're actually doing. So if you're in social media, you're actually obviously proactively many times, going through notifications, getting these dopamine kicks, and then you stay awake. And that's why, to wind down, there are a lot of things that you can do. One is obviously light, avoiding food a couple of hours before going to bed, but also finding your wind down routine that works for you. That could be reading a book, taking a shower, anything, avoiding conflicts, avoiding, thinking about work, etc. So you want to get your mind to a state where you can actually fall asleep easier.
That's great to know, because that was going to be one of my questions, was about Kindle. And I always try to encourage my kids to read. And we try to have a rule that all the phones and tablets go in the kitchen to charge at night. So they're all centralized, not in bedrooms. But I've always been okay with them having books or even their Kindle in their room. And if they're not tired, I'll tell them, like, stay up and read as long as you want, especially on days where they can get enough sleep in the morning. So that's great to know that that's probably not having a huge impact on their sleep quality, as long as it's not social media or something that's very stimulating to the brain, which makes sense. I would guess people listening have probably had that experience where they were on social media, where it's just constant dopamine hits and you're getting new information and notifications. And then you have to kind of sort of detox your brain from that before you can sleep. Whereas I feel like books can actually help you, like, calm the mind and get into a better sleep pattern at that point. You also mentioned not eating food a couple hours before bedtime. And I would love to talk more about this, because I think food is also an underestimated trigger when it comes to circadian biology. And just on a personal level, I've noticed, for instance, if I sort of try to front load my food toward the earlier part of the day, get lots of protein and nutrients early, and then taper off by sunset, I tend to have more deep sleep show up in my sleep scores, which kind of makes sense from just the fact that the liver is very active at night and it doesn't have to take resources from digestion to do all the things that happen during sleep. But what are some good guidelines for how long before sleep is optimal? Is there any type of timing of macros or food or nutrients that are better at night versus in the morning? And what do you suggest there?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you said it more or less as it should be. Basically, you aim to get a great breakfast so that you can kickstart your day, and then with the day progressing, you might want to decrease the quantity or the volume of food that you're getting, especially closer to bedtime, so that you can allow time for your body to process it and to get ready for bed. 1 calorie in the morning, in many ways, it's not the same as 1 calorie, in the evening, because your metabolism slows down in the evening, so you need more time potentially to process the food, and then you want to sleep. So your body, for example, tells you that it's time to fall asleep, but then your liver, because one thing that we didn't talk about is that it's not just one clock that we have. It's actually, we have a lot of clocks. Almost every organ has a clock. So the master clock is in the brain, and it's most impacted by light. So it's the kind of the orchestra, and the clock that is directing all the others. So, for example, we are getting close to bedtime, and then we are feeding ourselves. The liver clock is saying, well, I need time to process this. But the master clock is saying, well, we are going to bed. So metabolism goes down, etc., and it can lead to problems there. So that's why typically you'd want at least 2 to 3 hours before going to bed to stop eating. If you can, just drink water. If you really are hungry, if you're still getting into this, fasting mode, you might want to get some snacks, which are maybe sleep promoting, those that might have some quantity of melatonin in them, for example, or promoting melatonin. You can see them on the web You'd want to get some small snacks that are nutritious, that are not obviously junk food, which you want to avoid. High, sugary food might not be also a good option. So just, healthy food that is satisfying in some way, but at the same time, it's not making you really full so that you need time to process it.
That's great to know. And some tips I found is that another podcast guest explains certain foods actually help promote natural melatonin production. One of those he listed was pistachios, which I didn't know this, but they contain a small amount of melatonin, but it seems they don't increase your melatonin when you eat them. They increase your melatonin when your body is naturally ready to produce melatonin at night, so that eating pistachios during the day can actually help promote restful sleep. And so I've been experimenting with at nighttime. I try not to eat after sunset, but I will sometimes do a little bit of pistachios, a little bit of honey, and a little bit of sea salt, which that combination for me personally seems to lead to good sleep. So that's just a tip. And my kids like to do honey salt. My theory is that maybe that little bit of like sugar in the honey actually helps with glycogen stability throughout the night. And since we know the liver is very active during sleep, it seems like there might be an element of supporting that, but just a anecdotal sleep tip that works with my kids.
I'm also not an expert there, but I've also seen that pistachios definitely are a great great option. Maybe some snack of a handful of nuts could be also something that is going to keep you full, but at the same time, obviously you don't need a lot of time to process it. Fruits such as berries might be also a good option because they're very light, low caloric. Ideally, you just want to avoid food, but if you need to, these are some good options.
Makes sense.
And one thing, maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but it's about chronotypes and what you want to achieve actually, because some people are morning persons, others are evening persons, and then you have some which are balanced in the middle. And if you're an evening person or you want to adapt to a new time zone, for example, then when you eat obviously plays a bigger role, and we might also talk about that as well. So just a side note that this rule of 2-3 hours before going to bed might not, be fully applicable in most cases, cases.
Got it. And I do definitely want to get into chronotypes. Before we jump to that, though, we also talked about temperature as a potential needle mover for good sleep. So I would love to just touch on temperature and how someone can use that to their advantage to improve sleep and to improve focus and wakefulness during the day.
Yeah, so one thing that we want to bring across, it's called minimum core body temperature. So it occurs typically 2 to 3 hours before our natural wake-up time. This is the lowest point of temperature that we have throughout the day. If you expose yourself to light before this point, you delay your rhythm, meaning that you start to wake up and go to bed later. If you get light after this point, let's say in the morning, you kind of advance your rhythm. So that's why the minimum core body temperature is important. If we link this to how we actually warm up or cool down, if you're having a cold shower in the morning, this promotes up alertness, because with a cold shower, even though it sounds controversial, with cold shower you actually increase your core body temperature. We want to have higher core body temperature during the day to be active. That is why if you're exercising very close to going to bed, your core body temperature increases, but you want to actually cool down. So therefore, exercising just before going to bed might not be the best idea. You might want to exercise a couple of hours before so that you allow your body to cool down, decrease the core body temperature. And that is why when you're in the evening, you might want to get a warm shower, because with the warm shower, the after effect is that you start to decrease your minimum core body temperature and helping you promote sleep.
That makes sense. Okay. And you mentioned the word chronotypes, and I would love to delve into these. I'm also curious, as part of this conversation, if our chronotype can sort of shift at different phases of life, or when we implement some of these habits. For instance, I always thought I was a night owl, and I always thought I did my best work at night, and I was not a morning person. And when I started really getting morning sunlight and integrating these things we're talking about, I've discovered that I'm now naturally waking up around the time the sun wakes up, and I'm wide awake. And so I would call myself almost a morning person now, which I never thought I would do. So I'm curious, walk us through the chronotypes and if they can shift depending on our habits or depending on our phase of life.
Yes, of course. So the chronotype is a nature inclination towards being more active in the morning, in the evening, or somewhere, in the middle. So there are different types to classify them. Some classify them as dolphins, lions, etc. We typically use a more simpler term, which is morning person, evening person in a balance, someone who is in the middle. Roughly, we are typically 1/3 of the population is a morning person, 1/3 are evening, and 1/3 are balanced. And it does, as you mentioned, it changes throughout life. So if you're a teenager, late teens, adolescents, early 20s, your tendency goes towards being an evening person. Then adults, 25 to 65, we tend to be a bit more advanced, but not as much as when we're senior. So when we're elderly, we tend to be a bit more morning persons, and that's why many elderly, they look for ways to actually stay awake longer and go to bed later, because they tend to go to bed very early. Another reason, though, why late teens and teenagers in general, adolescents, why they shift their rhythm and delay their rhythm in general, is because obviously the social life, electronic device, and everything else that might have happened with you as well, that you've actually been a night owl. One of the reasons, because of that, you've been very probably socially active during these years. And then now, being a mother, and yeah, I see that as myself as well, being a father, you kind of advance your rhythm because you start waking up with your baby, you start to get the morning light, and then you shift your rhythm. Although naturally you might have been actually more of a balanced person rather than an evening person.
That makes sense as well. And I will say, as a mom, I've noticed that if you, even at the young infant stage, if you also can get your babies lined up with these light patterns, it seems to help their sleep adapt more quickly. I also always try to remind moms, anytime we talk about sleep, I think moms can get frustrated because those early years are difficult for sleep, just objectively tough. But it does seem like we get some helpful hormones that help us actually be able to deal with interrupted sleep more easily when we have a newborn. But my tip is always try to integrate these habits also from a young age with your kids, so they get a solid sleep foundation. And you also mentioned teenagers. It does seem like even if kids are pretty careful about avoiding screens and they're not on social media at night, it does seem like, at least I noticed it in me and now my own teenagers, there's a phase where we tend to be more night owl-like and want to sleep later. And I've heard sleep experts before say, if possible, lean into that. Let these kids stay up and read at night. Let them sleep late if possible, because there is a phase where they sort of naturally more move toward that, and it eventually will pass as they get older. But it seems like maybe teenagers waking up at 5 a.m. to go to school is tough on just where their phase of life is. And it's one reason I'm glad to homeschool, is because I can let my teenagers sleep till 9 and then do their school versus having to get up early. I know that's not available to everyone, but if possible, it seems like rather than wake them up super early, the rule of my house is you never wake a sleeping baby and you never wake a sleeping teenager.
Definitely. I think that, well said. It's crucial for teenagers to get the sleep that they need. And sadly, it's a hot topic nowadays. I think a lot of schools and even states are looking into delaying the school time. I think California, they even approved it to start at 8 a.m. the earliest. I remember when I was in high school, I was going to the other side of the city with public transport. I'll wake up 5:36. There is no way for me that I'm awake at that time. I'm a zombie, because we need, we go to bed later, wake up later. So typically maybe around 10-ish, 11, we are at our morning peak. So the hours before, we are not there yet. So definitely, we work, for example, with a lot of basketball teams, and for them to perform better in the morning, they use the device so they can get some light. If you're able to wake up and get some light before going to school, this will definitely help you. If there is a possibility for your teenager to kind of go to bed earlier, it's going to help them, but it's a bit difficult to do unless you use the tools that we mentioned here with, early waking up, going to get some light, maybe exercising as well, and eating. So the best combo, I think, is get up, get some light outside. If you can exercise, even you can combine the two. get light while exercising outside, and then come back and have a decent breakfast. This can really, this is the best way to start your circadian rhythm.
And let's talk about the device a little bit, because we haven't mentioned that yet, but I know that from your research in this, you've been involved with this device that actually helps some of these things we're talking about, especially if you're not able to just have this perfect pattern of morning sunlight and all these other things. So can you walk through what led to the creation of it and what it is doing when it comes to circadian biology?
Yeah, so we came up with the idea during our masters with my co-founder. He was the kind of the visionary who came up with the idea. We are both from sunnier countries. Even in winter, we get decent amount of sun. But in the Netherlands, we experienced the short winter days that could be quite gloomy as well. We got into the field of light. We tried some products on the market, which were at that time just light therapy boxes. And we decided this is a great tool to help you get the morning light, get the daily light if there is not enough outside, even if you want to, because if it's raining, even if you want to, you're not really able to get the light that you need. So we decided to create a wearable device that you can actually carry with you and use it in a very easy and convenient way. It emits blue light, which we mentioned is the most it's the most powerful for suppressing melatonin and adjusting the circadian rhythm. So that's the wearable. And we have also an element, which is the app as well, that is focused on circadian health. So it's giving you all the guidance that you need that we mentioned here. So first you fill in a questionnaire, you get your chronotype. Based on your chronotype and on your goal, whether this is waking up, for example, at 6, but currently you're waking up at 7, it gives you guidance on when to use the device, guidance in terms of light exposure, meal times, exercise times, etc. Ideally, you would be able to get the sunlight. If you're not, the second best is using light therapy or a product like ours. And we've seen that in our experiences. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people are not able to go out and get the morning light as you and me are able to do. And they need a tool like this. So kind of our mission is to help people understand and improve their circadian rhythm, understand that they have something called the circadian rhythm and how they can take charge of it. And we provide them with a tool, which is the wearable, giving you the light, and the knowledge, which is the application, and giving you the guidance and recommendations.
So this is basically, like you said, taking the place of something like a light box, and is also portable. Is this something that, like, back to the conversation of teenagers, that they could take with them to school in the morning or on the commute to school, things like that, to help their brains get more awake and alert?
Yeah, exactly. So if they're unable to get the morning light, the second best, as I said, is to get this light therapy. Use light therapy, use a wake-up light. But we've seen that with Teo, it's just so much easier than any lamp or a light therapy box, because you just pop it up on your face and then you're ready to go. You can make breakfast, you can prepare for leaving, or you can even use it, while commuting, not driving, but in the bus or in the car while someone else is driving. So that's something that can really help. And of course, during the day, you'd want to be engaged with other of the techniques that we mentioned here to further support your circadian rhythm. One thing I want to mention is that obviously the more you do of these, the better, but start from somewhere, see what works, and then try to expand from there. And if you skip one day, it's not a problem. Our bodies love consistency. But if nothing's going to happen if you don't do it one day, you don't get the light or you don't eat at the proper times. We are quite resilient, but the more you do and the more consistent you are, the better effect you'll have.
Yeah, that's a great point when it comes to the balance aspect of that. I always try to think of, I think Molly McLaughlin uses the term like social capital, and that there are times when I'm willing to deviate from this. Like most days I want to choose all the good inputs, but if there's like a late night gathering with friends where I'm going to have great social connection, we know community is very important. I'm willing to sacrifice optimal light exposure, optimal food timing, all those things, even sometimes a glass of wine to have that social connection. But most days I'm going to choose the good inputs. And I have learned over time, I think our like stress and guilt about not doing things perfectly can be much more damaging than not not doing things perfectly. So in those cases, I feel like choosing connection over perfection some days is actually a very healthy mental choice. I'd also love to talk about these factors in relation to a couple of special use cases that won't necessarily apply to everyone listening, but I know will very directly apply to a few people listening. The first being things like shift work. I hear from a decent amount of readers and listeners who do some form of shift work. And I know this is a difficult case to manage in general, because we know that our bodies, like we've talked about, are meant to line up with the natural light cycles of the earth. But there are times that they don't. And I'm very grateful for the people who work all night so that we can have medical care throughout the night. But these people probably have some special considerations when it comes to their circadian biology. So can you talk about, first of all, shift workers and how they can use these same things we've talked about to optimize their circadian biology within the constraints of shift work?
Definitely, as you said, shift work is essential. Around 20% of the population is involved in some sort of shift work. Shift work is probably the most challenging case to keep your biological clock in sync, just because of the frequency of night shift. It really depends, obviously, on the type of shift work that you have. Some are easier to tackle rather than others. I was also involved in shift work in Alaska. We used to work 16.5 hours every day. The good thing was that it was consistent. So it was the same amount of hours, same time. But a few years before, when I was 17, I was working in a supermarket, and there was the shift of 2-2-2, which is very typical. So 2 days day shift, 2 days night shift, 2 days resting days, which, although it might seem like a good balance, it really destroys your circadian rhythm, because the change is so frequent and so quickly that it's very difficult to actually adapt. So in these cases, if we have 2-2-2, we give guidance on alertness, for example, trying to help them understand and typically keep their rhythm more in line with their resting days and day shifts rather than the night shift. But in an ideal world, you'd want to talk to your employer if you're really in these frequent shift works, if you can do something about it. If you have like a week or two with one shift, even if it's night shift, you have a good chance to align your rhythm with the night shift. So what you'll want to do is, before the night shift, just everything that we talked about, but in reverse. What that means: before your night shift, especially if you are lucky enough to sleep, a good amount of hours before starting the night shift, you'd wake up, you would try to get light. Ideally, that will be from maybe the sunlight. Now in summer, it's a bit easier. If you can, get light therapy, or just try to turn on the lights, although light therapy would be more powerful. So you can really help your body wake up. The same goes for food, the same goes for exercise. So you can try to do these things before your night shift so that you can stay, more active. Then during the night shift, we many times also recommend doing another session if you start to feel sleepy. And then the other aspect is after the night shift, on your way home or when you get home, you want to avoid food, obviously a couple of hours before that, before going to bed. Also try to dim the lights, especially if when you go out, there is already daylight, so you want to use sunglasses, for example, something to dim the lights as much as possible. And when you go and try to sleep during the day, you try to ensure a cool, dark, and quiet environment. Use earplugs, anything that can really isolate you, so that you can try to get some rest. And when we have like 7, 14 days, or at least a few days, you are able to get your body a bit to the stage of, aligning to the night shift. But unfortunately, the harsh reality is that around 97% of all night shift workers are actually sticking to their day shifts, because we're just not made for such a night shift. So it's very difficult for us to cope. For night shift, obviously, night owls, it might be easier for them to stay awake during the night shift and kind of adapt easier. Same goes for if you're having a very early day shift, which starts very early. For morning larks, it might be easier for them to kind of cope with that and wake up earlier. But the goal here is to play with these factors, so light, exercise, and food, and temperature as well, and just try to utilize them in your benefit. And just try to talk to your employer to see what's possible to make the change not as dynamic, if possible, so that you can really support your rhythm.
Got it. And another time that is usually not a consistent thing that happens, but one that definitely does shift our circadian rhythms is jet lag. And I have a little bit of travel planned this year that will involve some pretty substantial jet lag. And I know many people listening, I'm sure, have had an experience with jet lag as well. So are there any things we can do international flights or big shifts in time zones, or during or after, to help minimize the stress on the body from jet lag?
Yeah, exactly. So the good thing with jet lag is that, as you said, it's not very frequent for most people. Of course, there are a lot of frequent travelers, executives, etc. But for most, if you're going on a summer vacation, you can actually start adopting these techniques already before your trip, so that you can be kind of halfway there, almost fully adapted once you get there. So, for example, if you're traveling from East Coast to London, you would want to have everything in advance. So in the sense that you'd want to get the morning light earlier in the morning, exercise early in the morning, so kind of advance your rhythm. The general rule of thumb is that if you're flying east, you want to advance your rhythm. If you're flying west, so from London going back to the US, you'd want to delay your rhythm, meaning that you would want to get the light in the evening. So that's the example that you mentioned, that you might want to, eat later in the day, exercise later in the day, so that you can stay awake longer and push your rhythm so you're able to fall asleep at the right time. And you can actually start the adaptation process already before, as I said. So a couple of days before your trip, you can already start waking up maybe half an hour, 1 hour earlier, get the light at that time, and you do that for a few consecutive days, your body is going to start adapting. Then when you're traveling, so in the flight, in the plane itself, you'd want to think, what is happening now at the local time? Is it time for me to eat? Probably it's not. If you're having an overnight flight, which is from, let's say, the East Coast to London, as you're mentioning, you might want to stop eating before the flight or earlier in the flight, and then just try to get some sleep, so that when you land and it's, I don't know, morning, that you can have, then a proper meal, get the light, etc. Another thing is, when we're flying east, especially if we cross a few more time zones, in the first couple of hours, typically in the morning, we would want to avoid light. So we would want to use sunglasses, maybe stay indoors, and then get the bright light, because it's still daylight, it's still night. So we want to adapt. And typically when we have our clients or customers going through long-haul travel, they reach out to us. We're happy to provide more personal guidance. The same goes for shift work. As much as we can, we are happy to help. And we've seen that adapting earlier before the trip is actually something that is quite beneficial, because when you land, especially if it's several hours of difference, you will need several days to adapt. So you want to save that and just enjoy your vacation.
Those are great tips. I'm curious your thoughts on melatonin. I never supplement with melatonin unless I'm traveling internationally. And similar to what you just said, my thought is always to try to slowly adapt my sleep timing a little bit the few days before. But then I love trying to book flights somewhere in like the 3 to 5 p.m. range, where and then I'll take melatonin usually on the flight, put on a sleep mask, put on noise canceling headphones, and try to sleep the whole flight rather than eat. And then as soon as I get there, it's usually morning time. Then I try to do those things you said, get bright light exposure, eat something, and also get outside on the ground as quickly as I can. But it seems like the device is actually another way to speed up that, because you can put that on as soon as you land in the airport. You don't even have to wait till you can get to the sunlight. But what are your thoughts on melatonin with international travel, especially?
Yeah, we know that a lot of people use it. Typically, AU is having a more natural effect, in the sense that it's providing you the light that is needed for suppressing melatonin. But when you need to actually produce melatonin, we know that it's more challenging. We know that a lot of people are using it. There are not that many side effects with melatonin as far as I know, but the challenge is that you would want to make sure that you're getting the right dosage, which is quite challenging because we don't have a way to ensure that. So just the way you're sourcing it, it should be from, I guess, good source so that you can be sure about that.
Gotcha. And to shift gears a little bit, I would also
Yeah.
love to talk about any tips for optimizing the sleep environment, because we've touched on these a little bit in the idea of temperature being important, of light exposure at night being a negative thing. I have gone to, over the years, really refined my sleep environment and kind of gone to extreme lengths, realizing we spend roughly a third of our life sleeping. So I try to put a lot of priority toward my sleep environment. Do you have any tips specific to creating a good sleep environment for us, for our kids, that can help lead to better sleep quality?
Yeah, well, I think that, the main, if you're looking exactly at the sleep environment, the main ones are, cool, quiet, making sure that you don't get light, easier to remove the electronic devices. So you don't, your brain is quiet, that this is your space for you. And outside of that, obviously light exposure is very important. We talked about that. I think the main one is really finding your wind down routine that works for you. Because that plays a major role. You want to go in bed and be ready to sleep. You don't want to crash, because this would mean that you're exhausted and then you're maybe sleep deprived, etc. So normally it takes up to, I think, 20 minutes to fall asleep, and this is normal range. But you don't want to go there and not be ready to fall asleep. So the goal is to wind down, find the thing that works for you. For me, that is typically breathing, or even listening to something that is monotonous and helps me get into this state. Other things are, for example, pets, unfortunately, are not typically helping you promote sleep because of many reasons. Even you just want to make sure that the sleep environment is such that you don't wake up that often. You might be careful with liquids as well. So you might stop drinking any liquids sometime before bed, depending, of course, on the season, if it's too warm, etc. But in general, you don't want to wake up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet. So that's one. We talked about food. So these are typically the main ones. There are also some supplements as well that you can potentially try. Magnesium is probably the one that has been mostly recommended by experts. So different ones. I think these are probably the main factors.
Awesome. I've been making notes for the show notes, and I agree with everything you're saying. Magnesium is also, I think, one that almost universally people can benefit from. I've talked about this before, but our soil is much more depleted of magnesium than it used to be. It's hard to get enough from food. Even people like Chris Kresser, who in the past have been very anti-supplement, now says, this is one that we just simply cannot get enough from food anymore. And it's one that seems to be very impactful for sleep. And I feel like this whole episode has been very applicable and practical tips for improving sleep quality. And I'll, of course, also make sure I link to the device in the show notes for people who want a much more convenient way to get that light exposure in the morning, especially on the go. But there's a few questions I love to ask toward the end of interviews. The first being if there is a book or number of books that have profoundly impacted your life, and if so, what they are and why.
Yeah, there are definitely many books and many things that have impacted my life. The one that I can think of is probably Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, because it's just so deep, profound, and it really tries really hard to help you understand what's your why, in a way that it's easy to understand. And I think that we as people having a why is so impactful, in the sense that we can just dedicate our lives in something that could be meaningful. So it's something that has had a big impact on me.
I certainly second that recommendation. That's one of my early in the year rereads, because it just really, I feel like, puts so many things in perspective and really is impactful for mindset. So it's one I love to recommend as well. I'll link to that in the show notes for you guys listening. All of that will be at wellnessmama.fm. And lastly, any parting advice for the listeners today that could be related to sleep and circadian biology, as we've been talking about, or entirely unrelated life advice that you have found valuable?
But as I said, my mission currently in life is really to help people understand that they have something which is called a circadian rhythm. And it's an internal mechanism that we have power to control, but we just need to understand how. And it's something that I believe it's going to have much bigger importance in the years to come, because we're understanding more and more of it. So we know a lot about it, but we are still at the beginning of how it actually works in cases such as taking medicines, for example, or supplements, when is the best time for us in terms of chronotypes. So basically, it can really affect an effect of, for example, a drug. When we're taking a drug for cardiovascular disease or for cancer, going through chemotherapy, etc., it can have a profound effect, the timing of the day or night. So as an advice, I can just share, think about your circadian rhythm, make sure that you always keep it at the back of your mind, and try to really live in sync with it, because it can help you live better, healthier, and longer.
Great advice. And I know that you have resources also on your website as well as the device itself. So I'll make sure that's linked. You guys check it out. That is all at wellnessmama.fm, like I said. And Alex, this has been such a fun conversation. I think the importance of sleep cannot be overstated, especially in today's world. We know we're not getting quality sleep. And I really appreciate you providing all these super applicable tips to help us all improve our sleep, even at the phases of life where that's naturally tougher, like motherhood, like shift work, like having teenagers. So I'm very grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Katie. I appreciate the invitation, and I really hope that it's been helpful to the audience.
And thanks to all of you, as always, for listening and sharing your most valuable resources, your time, your energy, and your attention with us today. We're both so grateful that you did. And I hope that you will join me again on the next episode of the Wellness Mama podcast.